April 6, 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing around the Allies' ears, but here, 2/3 of a mile down, was a profound, cold silence. Thuringia, the heartland of Germany. Beneath the quiet, unassuming village of Merkers lay a vast salt mine carved out by generations of industry, a world of ancient, glittering rock. The air was cold, dry, and carried a faint taste of brine. Only the rhythmic hum of ventilation fans and the distant metallic drip of water disturbed the stillness. The scene captured on a sheet of black and white film looked almost disappointingly ordinary. An American soldier, dust-covered, exhausted, his uniform washed pale by the mine's fine salt, bending over a crate and documenting its contents under the harsh glare of a miner's lamp. The shadows stretched long across the cavern walls, turning the moment into something stark and utilitarian. It was pure Signal Corps realism, a routine act of wartime paperwork. But the frame captured something no one yet understood. It recorded the exact moment the Allies brushed against the surface of a horde far larger than anyone expected. The photographer, a member of the US Signal Corps, had no reason to think he was witnessing anything world-changing. He was simply doing his job, documenting captured sites for the Army's official record. But this plain, unglamorous frame would become a spark that shot up the entire Allied chain of command. What it hinted at was too significant to ignore. Soon, the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, would decide to descend 2,100 feet into the earth to see the truth himself. Patton and Bradley would follow. It was an unprecedented move for men who were supposed to be directing entire fronts of a global war, not climbing into freight lifts in the middle of Germany. Because the photo wasn't just evidence of items stored underground, it pointed to something far more strategic, the possibility that the Nazis had hidden enormous portions of their financial reserves and cultural loot in a single subterranean vault. The image suggested a scale and organization that matched what Allied intelligence had long suspected, but never confirmed. There was no time to waste. The mine sat inside territory designated, by treaty, to pass into Soviet control within weeks. The Red Army was closing fast. If the Allies didn't move first, everything buried down here, currency, bullion, artwork, would fall into Soviet hands. One photo, 3 generals, a collapsing empire's last secret. This is the story of how a dusty image taken under a miner's lamp became the catalyst for one of the most urgent, high-stakes recoveries of the entire war. The man behind the lens was a member of the US Signal Corps, one of thousands assigned to capture the visual record of a dying regime. His name didn't survive in reports, but his purpose was clear: document everything. This would be the official record the Army would use long after the guns went silent. Every frame carried weight: dates, locations, coordinates. A photograph was considered a factual anchor in a war full of rumor and chaos. That mandate is what gave this image its immediate credibility. When the first Signal Corps photographs from inside the mine reached Third Army headquarters, American soldiers standing in front of sealed sacks and stacked crates, the effect was unmistakable. It was treated as evidence, a fixed point in a shifting battlefield. Had the information arrived as rumor alone, whispered by exhausted prisoners or frightened civilians, it likely would have been dismissed. But a Signal Corps photograph stripped away uncertainty. It confirmed that something was down there, and it wasn't small. The rumors themselves had been circulating for days. French and Belgian forced laborers, newly freed from the surrounding salt works, told officers of the 90th Counterintelligence Corps what they had witnessed. Trucks rolling in under darkness, sealed crates moved with machinery, German guards insisting on absolute secrecy. They didn't know what was being stored. They only knew the activity was relentless, organized, and far beyond what a mining operation needed. Their testimonies lined up with a pattern Allied intelligence already recognized. As the bombing campaign intensified, The Reich had been pushing its critical assets underground: factories, archives, research programs, and anything too valuable to risk on the surface. Salt mines were ideal: dry, stable, naturally cool, easy to seal, hard to destroy. The Allies had seen smaller caches elsewhere, but nothing on this reported scale. Still, the CIC officers were cautious. Unverified stories in wartime often collapsed under scrutiny. They checked aerial photographs. They studied reports of unusual supply movements around the mine. The pattern held. But it was the photographs, physical proof of American soldiers already inside the tunnels, that turned suspicion into something actionable. It confirmed the location, confirmed the presence of storage crates, and confirmed that the underground activity wasn't imaginary or exaggerated. By the time the intelligence summary hit senior desks, the tone had shifted. This no longer looked like a place where a retreating army dumped leftover equipment. It looked deliberate, structured, centralized. A secure underground site holding assets the Nazis clearly wanted protected. That was the moment the mood changed. What began as a routine mop-up operation was upgraded to a priority target. The Allies had stumbled onto something planned, not improvised. And the photographs, plain, grainy, and dust-streaked from the mine, became the anchor for what came next. On April 8th, Lieutenant Colonel William A. Russell of Civil Affairs and a small security team began their descent. The access point was the mine's freight lift, a massive industrial elevator built to haul tons of salt rock to the surface. As it groaned downward, the war above felt like it was evaporating. The cage rattled through a vertical tunnel of darkness, walls flashing in and out of the lamplight. Every meter down felt like leaving the world and entering something older and colder. At roughly 700 meters, the team stepped off into a maze of tunnels carved over decades. They moved by the directions given to them by forced laborers, turns, shafts, alcoves, until they reached a broad junction miners referred to as the Gold Room. The name, Russell would soon learn, wasn't an exaggeration. The sight was overwhelming. The early photographs had shown only a fraction of what was there. The reality was that it was a landscape. Stacked bags, chests, and trunks rose almost to the cavern ceiling. Rows of crates stretched into the darkness like a warehouse built underground. It didn't look improvised. It looked intentional, organized. The first items they examined were the currency bags, hundreds of them, filled with banknotes from multiple countries. Reichsmarks, yes, but also foreign currency from across occupied Europe. For Russell, this didn't read as last-minute hoarding. It read as a structured financial relocation. But the currency was only the surface. Deeper inside the cavern, the air thickened with the smell of aging wood. What the early photographs showed was only the outer edge of the cache. Beyond them were more, dozens upon dozens, many marked with institutional seals from major German agencies. It was enough to make clear this was not the private stash of fleeing officials. Someone high up had to have organized this. Russell directed his men to open a set of suitcases stacked near the center. Instead of documents or personal effects, they found gold bullion. Bar after bar. Each stamped with markings from foreign national banks, proof that the Nazis had transported their own reserves and the reserves of other nations they had absorbed or overrun. In that moment, the meaning of the photograph snapped into focus. It had captured only a sliver of what lay hidden. The cavern was far larger, far fuller, and far more consequential than anyone reading reports above ground had imagined. Russell filed his findings immediately. The language was plain and urgent. The site contained vast quantities of financial and cultural assets, enough to demand attention from the highest level of Allied command. This accelerated the chain reaction. The reality Russell saw ensured it couldn't be ignored. With the entry point secured and the initial survey complete, the mission shifted from curiosity to documentation. The team began opening crates under the harsh glare of portable lamps, each lid revealing another piece of the Reich's underground economy. The first overwhelming confirmation came with the bullion. The volume was substantial, far more than any field unit expected to encounter underground, but its real significance lay in the markings. The bars weren't stamped with German identifiers. They carried assay and mint marks from multiple European national banks, the kind used to track official reserves. This was state-held gold from nations the Nazis had overrun: Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Italy, others. Each bar a silent transfer of sovereignty, boxed and lowered into the earth. Alongside the bullion were sacks of mixed precious metals, including items clearly sourced from civilian populations, rings, fragments, and personal objects stripped of identity. The team had seen enough war to know what that meant. It tied the mine not only to the looting of states, but to the confiscation programs that targeted entire persecuted communities. The value was immense, but the moral weight was heavier. The second section of the cavern held something even more staggering: crates upon crates, carefully stacked, sealed, and labelled. When the team opened the first few, canvas edges and wooden frames emerged, masterworks by European artists whose names sat at the heart of museum catalogues. The number of art crates ran into the thousands. The works inside were unmistakably significant. What struck Russell's team wasn't only the presence of high-value pieces, it was the orderliness. Catalogue numbers, inventory lists, tags referencing major German cultural agencies. These items were part of a coordinated seizure program carried out by specialists who knew exactly what they were taking and why. The goal was clear: curate the cultural identity of Europe under Nazi terms, funneling its artistic heritage into controlled repositories for eventual use in state projects like the envisioned Führer Museum. This was cultural engineering. The mine itself was a revelation. Most underground caches the Allies had discovered suffered from moisture, heat, or structural instability. Merkers did not. The salt chamber was naturally dry and cool, conditions archivists could only dream of. Paper stayed crisp. Paintings didn't warp. Wood didn't rot. Salt absorbed moisture from the air, preserving everything with uncanny efficiency. Someone had chosen Merkers with calculation. It wasn't the closest mine. It was the safest. The environment explained why so much had been consolidated here in the war's final phase. By the end of the day, Russell's team knew the initial photographs had shown almost nothing. The real machinery of the vault stretched far beyond the reach of any lens. The foreign bank markings on the bullion, the organized cataloguing of the art, the sheer breadth of stored currency and valuables, the deliberate selection of the mine, all of it pointed in one direction. This was one of the most methodical programs of economic and cultural theft ever carried out by a modern state. What began as a dusty image taken underground had become physical, undeniable proof. The reports from Lieutenant Colonel Russell hit Third Army headquarters like a shockwave. The claims were enormous, far beyond the usual scale of captured materials, and the initial reaction was almost reflexive skepticism. Staff officers who had spent years filtering out exaggeration, propaganda, and battlefield rumor simply couldn't accept that a single mine might hold assets of such scale and organization. Reports of currency, bullion, and cultural property stacked deep underground sounded closer to wartime folklore than verifiable intelligence. Behind closed doors, the doubt was blunt. Senior officers questioned whether Russell's team had misread the scale or mistaken the origin of the materials. Others wondered if scattered caches were being mentally combined into one narrative. And some suspected deliberate deception, displaced workers exaggerating stories, or even the possibility of misinformation meant to pull manpower away from the final push toward Berlin. There was also the issue of plausibility. Why would the Nazis consolidate valuable materials so close to the front lines? Why a salt mine that was already known to local workers? The skepticism wasn't irrational. It was born from logistics, timing, and decades of military training. Extraordinary claims demanded extraordinary proof. That proof was sitting on the table. The Signal Corps photographs, now enlarged and circulated, confirmed that American personnel were already deep inside the mine, working exactly in the area Russell described. His documentation of foreign markings on bullion and the orderly cataloguing on the crates reinforced what the images implied. The pieces fit too neatly to dismiss. The disbelief began to erode, replaced by an unsettling awareness that the mine might be far more significant than anyone had imagined. Then came the pressure no staff officer could ignore. The Yalta agreements meant Thuringia would soon fall under Soviet administration. The Red Army was moving fast. If the mine held even a fraction of what Russell described, failing to act meant allowing an immense concentration of assets to pass directly into Soviet hands. The hesitation evaporated. The question became brutally simple. Move now, commit resources, and verify the truth, or step aside and watch the contents of the mine shift the balance of post-war power. The images had created the tension. The geopolitical clock resolved it. The trial phase became a frantic two-day push to determine the full scope of what lay underground. Lieutenant Colonel Russell was assigned a small but specialized team: engineers, security personnel, and members of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program. Their mission was straightforward: gather fast, conclusive evidence of scale before the window of control closed. Working at the 2,100-foot level under the glare of portable lamps, they began the slow, methodical task of opening crates and recording what they found. The atmosphere was suffocating from more than just the depth. Every box opened chipped away at the idea that this was a simple wartime cache. The currency alone stretched their expectations. Bag after bag held banknotes gathered through seizure programs across occupied Europe. The teams recognized financial paperwork patterns: bundled accounts, consolidated notes, organized lots, pointing toward large-scale confiscation efforts that had been running for years. Each sack was a quiet ledger of what had been stripped from families and institutions. The MFAA specialists moved through the art storage area with a different set of tools. They recognized cataloging styles, numbering systems, and packing techniques used by German agencies that had handled looted collections. Their logs filled quickly. The works they identified represented a cross-section of Europe's most significant cultural holdings, items tracked, classified, and moved with purpose. As engineers surveyed the cavern, they realized the visible crates were only the entry point. The chamber branched outward into secondary storage areas, some sealed, some partially collapsed, others still intact. The mine's structure suggested multiple phases of storage across different tunnels, a layout that hinted at far more material than what had been exposed so far. The deeper they worked, the larger the operation appeared. Ledger pages filled with inventory numbers, gold markings, currency identifiers, art accession notes. The logs grew faster than they could process them. The scale was accelerating beyond any estimate the team walked in with. By the end of the second day, the implications were unavoidable. The photograph that had started this chain reaction had shown a narrow slice of a very large structure. The teams had mapped only the central chamber, while the mine's blueprints hinted at entire sections still sealed off. Time was the enemy. Proper inventory work would take months, possibly longer, yet the territory was only under American control for a short window before the Soviet administration took over. Every hour that passed felt like sand slipping through fingers. This phase made something clear to everyone involved. There was no way to treat this as a routine discovery. The scale demanded oversight from the highest level of Allied command, and fast. 2,100 feet down, the war had taken on a new dimension. The front line was a vault, and the clock was running. The evidence Russell's team collected, inventory logs, photographs, confirmation from MFAA specialists, went straight into an emergency briefing. It was enough to override every remaining doubt. The scale of what lay underground wasn't something to delegate or summarize on paper. It demanded eyes at the top. On April 12th, General Dwight D. Eisenhower made a rare decision. He would go down the mine himself. It was an unusual move for the Supreme Allied Commander. His time was measured in fronts and divisions, not freight elevators and underground vaults. But Merkers wasn't another battlefield report. If it was what it appeared to be, it had enormous implications for the post-war world. He brought two senior commanders with him, General George S. Patton and General Omar N. Bradley. Between them, they controlled the most powerful land forces ever assembled on the continent. And now all three were preparing to descend into a mine on the basis of a single photograph and the hurried reports of a civil affairs colonel. The scene could have been mistaken for a stage set. The three generals stepped into the industrial freight lift, wearing helmets and field gear, the lamp beams catching on metal rails and rough rock walls as the elevator groaned downward. The deeper they went, the quieter everything seemed to become, as if the war above had been sealed off behind them. At the 2,100-foot level, the cavern air wrapped around them, cool, dry, and utterly still. Lieutenant Colonel Russell led the group through the tunnels, their footsteps echoing against salt-coated stone. When they entered the main chamber, the scale of the vault revealed itself in an instant. Lamps cut wide arcs of light across stacks of crates, bags, trunks, and chests. Gold bars arranged for inventory. Currency bags piled in rows. Art crates lining the walls. Eisenhower walked to one of the stacks of bullion. He examined the markings. Foreign mint stamps, bank identifiers, the kind used to track national reserves. He had seen war from every angle, but this was different. It was the physical ledger of a continent's plunder. Bradley studied the rows of currency bags, taking in the sheer volume. Patton moved restlessly through the space, absorbing the layout, the orderliness, the sense that this underground chamber held the financial residue of years of occupation. Nothing about it felt improvised. This was organized, state-level movement of assets, not opportunistic looting. With their inspection complete, the order went out. The vault was to be emptied. The assets were to be moved to secure Allied territory, and it would begin at once. The photograph had triggered the descent. What the generals saw underground triggered the mission. Eisenhower's inspection changed everything. What had started as a lower-level intelligence alert instantly became a matter for SHAEF, the senior Allied command in Europe. The discovery was no longer just a regional concern or an interesting footnote. It was a strategic asset sitting inside territory scheduled to be transferred to Soviet administration. The objective was clear: move the cash while the Allies still controlled the ground. That directive triggered one of the most urgent logistical efforts of the final month of the war. Phase 1. Mobilization and extraction. Patton's Third Army diverted trucks, personnel, and security units to Merkers almost immediately. Vehicles normally used for ammunition and supply runs were now redirected to a rural salt mine. Military police surrounded the area. Infantry detachments tightened control of the entrance. The mine became a checkpoint, a vault, and a bottleneck all at once. Inside, the work was relentless. Crews lifted bags of currency, crates of bullion, and thousands of containers filled with cultural property up from the deep freight shafts. Each load required coordination between engineers underground and soldiers waiting on the surface. It was tedious, physical labor performed under a clock that everyone knew was ticking down. The gold was moved first. Art and documents followed. Nothing about it was glamorous. It was controlled chaos, men dragging the economic remnants of an empire out of the earth before a geopolitical deadline expired. Phase 2. The convoy. Once loaded, the trucks rolled out in guarded columns. The routes were chosen carefully, avoiding unstable pockets of resistance and minimizing visibility. Radio communication was limited. The cargo was valuable enough to warrant caution. The destination was Frankfurt am Main, a secure administrative center within the American zone. There, the assets could be catalogued, stored, and kept out of the shifting territorial negotiations still underway as Germany collapsed. By securing the materials before the transfer of Thuringia to Soviet control, the Allies ensured that the vault's contents remained available for international restitution, financial stabilization, and post-war legal processes. The recovered reserves helped the Allies maintain control over economic reconstruction in their occupation zones. Without access to these assets, the process of rebuilding institutions and stabilizing currency would have been far more chaotic. The documentation created during the extraction, logs, inventories, photographs, became foundational evidence in post-war efforts to identify stolen property and return it to national governments and private families. It established one of the first large-scale, coordinated attempts to track and repatriate looted assets. Merkers forced SHAEF to formalize procedures for the recovery and protection of cultural and financial property. This shaped how similar discoveries were handled across Europe in the following months. The mine became a turning point in how the Allies approached the economic remains of the Reich. The discovery reshaped policy, diplomacy, and the early architecture of post-war justice. The removal of the Merkers cache brought the discovery into a new phase, one defined less by physical danger and more by diplomatic friction, legal disputes, and decades of administrative wait. The vault was empty, but the arguments that followed it were only beginning. Friction with the Soviet Union. Merkers lay inside the area designated for Soviet occupation under the Yalta agreements. When the Red Army arrived to find the vault cleared and the assets moved to American-controlled territory, the reaction was immediate and sharp. Soviet officials questioned the timing of the transfer and pressed the Western Allies for explanations. American officers responded by pointing to the urgent conditions on the ground. The mine was in an unstable region, the Wehrmacht was still capable of scattered resistance, and the vault held assets critical to international financial stability and restitution efforts. The disagreement added to the growing list of wartime tensions that, within months, would harden into the early framework of the Cold War. Merkers became an example often cited in diplomatic correspondence, a symbol of how fragile the Allied partnership had become by the war's end. Inventory gaps and long-term disputes. The speed of the extraction created inevitable gaps. The mine was enormous and compartmentalized, and not every chamber could be fully examined before the region changed hands. The initial cataloguing, while careful, was conducted under immense pressure. In the years that followed, questions emerged. Which items had been fully documented? Which materials had been moved earlier in the war? Which artworks belonged to national collections versus private families? These uncertainties fed into the broader, decades-long challenge of Nazi-era restitution. Some assets surfaced in museums, archives, and private collections around the world. Others were harder to trace, especially bullion or objects with damaged provenance records. The Merkers discovery exposed how vast and tangled these questions were. A blueprint for post-war justice. Merkers became one of the seminal case studies in understanding the scale and structure of Nazi economic plunder. It demonstrated that the theft was not improvised or isolated. It was coordinated, catalogued, and embedded in the financial machinery of the regime. The documentation gathered during and after the extraction became foundational material for emerging restitution frameworks. It shaped how the Allies built post-war institutions devoted to identifying stolen property, adjudicating claims, and returning cultural and financial assets to rightful owners. Merkers was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of decades of legal, moral, and archival work that continues today. The Merkers mine photograph holds a distinct legacy among the millions of images captured during World War II. It wasn't a picture of combat, liberation, or surrender. It was a picture of dust, crates, and paperwork. Yet it exerted more influence on Allied policy than many battlefield images. In one unadorned frame, the photograph verified what had long circulated as rumor: that the Nazi state had hidden enormous reserves of financial and cultural property in subterranean repositories. After Merkers, the idea of Nazi gold was no longer speculation. It was geographically fixed, visually confirmed, and tied to identifiable institutions across Europe. The discovery clarified something essential about the nature of the Reich. Its power wasn't only built on armies and ideology. It relied on a systematic, bureaucratic extraction of wealth, national reserves, cultural treasures, personal assets, moved with the same administrative precision as its military campaigns. The photo exposed the scale of that machinery. Merkers became a reference point in establishing new standards for identifying, cataloguing, and ultimately repatriating looted property. Its legacy is often summarized this way: the photograph turned a hidden economic crime into an observable fact. It gave governments, museums, and central banks a tangible starting point for the long process of returning stolen assets. And it established a precedent that documentation, however plain it may appear, can force nations to confront difficult truths and act on them. Decades have passed since the salt dust settled on the floor of the Merkers mine. Today, the cavern where Allied forces once worked under harsh lamps is a quiet exhibit space. The bullion, banknotes, and crates of art are long gone, distributed to national authorities, central banks, and museums as part of the post-war restitution process. What remains is the memory of the scale and the implications. And at the center of that memory sits a single black and white photograph. History often reveals itself through spectacle: the clash of armies, flags raised on rooftops, signatures on surrender papers. But some of the most consequential truths are uncovered through the smallest fragments of evidence. The Merkers images prompted the highest commanders of the Allied armies to descend more than 2,000 feet into the earth. It pulled their attention away from collapsing front lines and toward a different kind of battlefield, one defined by ledgers, currencies, and cultural identity. And it transformed an abstract understanding of Nazi economic policy into a physical reality that could no longer be ignored.